Okay, nau mai, haere mai ki te webinar a te mana tutikanga o Aotearoa. Kia ora tātou, ko Nick Ascroft, aho. Yes, welcome to Standards New Zealand's webinar. We're talking about the new committee handbook. You'll see that your mics are muted and that your cameras are off. That is all correct. We're doing a webinar here. Thank you so much for joining. I'm aware you're appearing from right across the standardization ecosystem. So thanks everyone for joining. I know you've all got a lot of expertise on these matters yourselves. We will just present a few slides about the new committee handbook. Some of the stuff in there that's some of it is going back to basics for a lot of you, but I think it's always good to look over it again. And after about 40 minutes of talk, we'll have some Q&A. And the Q&A, the way it's going to work is if you look at your screen, there should be a little icon and nearest the top left with Q&A and like speech bubbles. If you click on that, at any point during this webinar, you can enter your question. And at the end, Ramola, who you can probably see on screen there, is going to be looking through those, and we'll be asking the best of those questions, or the ones that we can fit in, hopefully all of them, to me. And I've got some accomplices here I'll introduce shortly who can also probably be quite good at answering some of those questions. You can ask the curliest of questions. We won't always have the answer, but it's a good opportunity to do it. So first of all, it's probably good just to have a little look at the handbook itself, very briefly. Let's see if I can do this. Here we go. This is the handbook. It's large, 144 pages, so it's a resource, ideally, that you can dip into. I just want to show you, if you're not aware, that one of the easiest way to get around some of these types of PDF is this little bar here, the bookmark bar, which basically has the entire table of contents here, so you can just click on and jump around and see all of the different sections. I know that's probably too small to read on many of your screens. Just showing it for how it's working. So there's a lot of sections. You can often find the topic you want and then dash around, read it from cover to cover if you like. Well, that would be good, but I'm sure that you'll be looking at it for specific answers to specific queries at times. Okay, I'll get into the slides. Here they go. So yes, hopefully that's appearing on your screens. If it is not appearing on your screens, the slides, you may want to drop into the Q&A and just let us know. And if we see about 50 of those people saying we can't see the slides, then we will react accordingly, probably with panic. So we've got 3 of us here to talk to some of the slides today. Your dealings with Standards New Zealand are likely with a range of different people, and you've perhaps come across me before. I'm here just noted as the lead author of the new handbook. There was a previous handbook, of course, and this is an update that I've written some of, I've worked with others on, and we've dealt with some of what I think are the curliest questions in standards development and elsewhere. So we've got me, we've got Roy Pryer, Manager Standards Development, we've got Ramola Duncan, who is the International Mirror Committee person, I think is the best way to describe Ramola. So if you dealt with Camilla in the past and haven't yet dealt with Ramola, it will be Ramola. You likely also may be dealing with Shaol and Sugra, Mayu, Chris Forsman, Brian Bell, Gleb, Steve Garner, or Glenda, project managers on various tasks. But this is who we have today. What are we talking about? Well, we've got 6 topics, and then time for the questions. It's a webinar, as I say, not a workshop. So mostly we will be talking about what the new handbook says, but we do acknowledge that a lot of you have valuable insight into good practice of committees, and also there are too many topics in the handbook to cover in this webinar. But we think it's helpful to be reminded of what good committee practice is, and to think about how we can all contribute to that. We can all help committees run smoothly and ensure that the results of committee work is the kind of new standards that New Zealand needs. So yes, first of all, we're just going to have a look at what's in the handbook. We're going to have a look at the different types of committees, and I'll be bringing in Roy and Ramola at that point. One of the key topics and standards is consensus. We'll have a little chat about that. And this is just a great topic to think about at any point, I think, if you're involved in standards. International standards. Why do we adopt them? And when is it appropriate to make national modifications? And then finally, if there's time, we'll look at some of the best practice for committee members. And then we'll have a Q&A. So what's in the new handbook? There are many things. We cover types of the committees, the types of publications, and the types of projects that development committees have. In this webinar, I'll refer to development committees when I'm talking about New Zealand only committees or joint New Zealand Australian committees for developing standards. We also call our mirror committees development committees at times. And when I say mirror committees, I'll be referring to the international review groups that are participating members on a particular ISO or IEC that are reviewing the work of a technical committee. So we look at the process of standards development, we look at mirror committee work, we look at the roles, and we dig into some of the key concepts in standards and try and elucidate them a bit in a way that's ultimately going to be helpful. We have to talk about the Standards and Accreditation Act and another law as how it governs committee work. There's a good long section on conflicts of interest, which are important to manage. Copyright and permissions, and yes, there's a new code of conduct. We're folding that into practice for committees at the moment, but it was not something we had across all of our committees until recently. So zooming in a little, looking at the types of committees, there are actually quite a few different types and functions for committees in New Zealand. And I guess one of the things we wanted to do with the handbook is to broaden people's horizons who aren't already across the different types, and perhaps it could be the case that if you're already on an international mirror committee, you might be interested in also being on a development committee, and vice versa. So there's different opportunities and different ways of accessing those opportunities. So we just wanted to have everything together, because ultimately the volunteer work has a similar focus and a similar level of expertise in the different camps. Yes, the different types of publications, they are quite different. There's a difference between a standard and, when I say standards related publications, we're talking about technical specifications, handbooks, publicly available specifications and the like. And amendments are different again, because they're really just a list of changes. And that makes the projects that those committees take on quite different as well. So if you're a committee working on a new standard is very different work from a committee working on a revision. And if you're a committee working on whether focused on an adoption, so whether an international standard should be a New Zealand standard, the focus is different again. You don't have to be drafting the text itself. And as I say, amendments are different work. What are we not covering here? I won't get into the Act here. I feel like there's a lot there, but please read the answer to all of these bullets is please do have a look at the committee handbook. Yes, I've summarised the code of conduct into 8 words, if I can count correctly. 9. Work together for the benefit of all and show respect. That would have been quicker if I'd just written that. We're going to not talk about copyright and permissions, but yes, don't steal stuff. And we're not going to be talking about conflicts of interest, but yes, you declare financial interest, and we can sort that out. I also want to be talking about the Te Tiriti lens on standards development. I think this is probably more fitting for its own webinar or maybe even a workshop as to how we can better serve the treaty in standards development. Okay, moving on to the different types of committee, I will be handing over to one of our other presenters, and it is to Ramola.
Thanks, Nick. So what are international mirror committees? International mirror committees are New Zealand committees that mirror the work of ISO and IEC technical committees, and their role is to monitor international standards as they are being developed and to help shape New Zealand's position on that work. Mirror committees provide the forum where New Zealand experts come together to review drafts, discuss issues, and develop national comments and voting positions. And this is how New Zealand has a coordinated, informed voice in international standards development. But most importantly, mirror committees do not write international standards themselves. Instead, they influence them by contributing expertise early, identifying issues that matter for New Zealand, and ensuring our views are fed into the international process. And that's why participation in a mirror committee allows New Zealand to influence standards, and also make sure that rather than simply reacting to them once they are published. And that influence is especially important when international standards are likely to be adopted in New Zealand later. Mirror committees also play a key role in ensuring, I'm going to go back to the slide that we were there, yeah. So mirror committees also play a key role in assessing whether an international standard is suitable for New Zealand use, including whether adoption can be identical or whether any justified local modifications might be needed. In short, mirror committees are how New Zealand stays connected, influential, and informed in the international standard system, ensuring global standards work for us locally. And the experts on mirror committees play a very vital role in shaping our international standards by contributing their technical knowledge, representing national interests, and ensuring consensus-based decision-making. And currently, ISO committee has around 275 technical committees and IEC has around 230. But New Zealand itself has around 90 mirror committees. And there's also an expression of interest form that we have shared in the Q&A chat. So if you're interested to be, involved with international mirror committees, please reach out to us.
Thanks, Ramola. I'll take from here. So kia ora, Roy Pryer. I'm the manager for the standards development team. So I'm going to just talk briefly about joint Australian and New Zealand standards committees. Joint committees, as the name implies, are a single committee with both Australian and New Zealand members. They bring a range of expertise, knowledge, skills, and views. And the idea is that the two countries are combining the skills and expertise that exist to come up with a better whole and also to produce a standard that is as far as possible the same in both countries. So a joint standard ideally will be exactly the same in both Australia and in New Zealand. We benefit quite a lot from having the larger size that Australia brings in terms of numbers of people, but there are also areas where New Zealand has expertise that Australia doesn't, and so we're contributing back in that respect with key information, key areas of expertise that the Australians otherwise wouldn't have. Typically, joint committees are standing committees, which means, unlike New Zealand specific committees, which are stood up to do a task and deliver, we revise a specific standard and then the committee kind of goes away until the next time. These committees have a range of standards that they are working on. They may be working on just one at a time, or they may be working on a suite of standards, 2, 3, 4, or more. And as they finish working on the revision or the adoption or the amendment of one standard, they've got another one in the pipeline that's coming up. And often they follow the international cadence. So if ISO or IEC are revising standards that feed into these joint committees, then those committees will be looking at them as they come out of ISO or IEC to see whether they're suitable for identical adoption in Australia and New Zealand, or whether they require some minor modification. And a good example of modification is if we have an electrical safety standard, for example, we might modify it to say that the acceptable voltage range within Australia and New Zealand is between M and P, whereas the international standard may say between A and Z. So we will be a little bit more specific about that. And that's a really good reason why we try to encourage, going back to Ramola, why we try to encourage international participation from New Zealand, because it helps to get the New Zealand perspective in, so that it's easier for us to do an identical adoption when those standards flow out of the international committees. The idea behind the joint standard is harmonized guidance. There's one set of rules for manufacturers, for suppliers, for tradespeople. We're working to the same rules. We're working in the same way, and it makes it easier for goods and services to be traded between us and Australia. Unlike the international committees, we typically ask for a nominating organisation. These are usually industry bodies or government agencies, regulators, or crown entities. We have also academic institutes who are often bringing an expert body of knowledge at that sort of evolving forefront, I guess, or evolving frontier. The idea is that we have the nominated person is then representing the larger organisation. So we have input to the committee and then feedback to the organisation, and input to the committee and feedback to the organisation. So we get a larger breadth of input, I guess, into those committees. But they follow the same process realistically for how standards are made. And you can see here a wheel that lists a lot of stages, and this is a good way of representing the process that we follow, and that is followed for joint standards development as well when we step through. So if we look at the start up here at the top, we start off with often with a scoping exercise. Now this can be a formal scoping exercise where someone says, we want to know what is the best way to revise standard X. We need to decide what is actually wrong with standard X, because we know that it's been in existence for a few years and we think we know what the problems are, but we want to be sure. Or it can be a simple proposal where the industry body themselves has said, look, we've looked at this, these are the problems that we've identified and we want to fix these things. But either of those will lead us to a proposal to revise or to amend or possibly to adopt something new. We will work with the submitter of that proposal. We'll work with potential commissioning bodies, and Standards Australia will be doing the same thing. We refine that proposal when we get it to a point where we think, yep, we know what we need to do, we've agreed what we are going to be doing, and then we step into the committee formation stage. Now, if this is a standing joint committee, the committee formation stage is almost arbitrary. However, every time we have a proposal to take part in a joint standard, we will look to increase the New Zealand membership on that committee. And the reason that we do that is to try to get more spread across the New Zealand sector, to try to spread the load. Sharing is caring, and if we can spread the love around standards development a little bit widely, then we'll have more people feeding in from the New Zealand perspective and making sure that our needs and interests are well catered for. But often with a standing committee, we have people, for it to be joint, we have people from New Zealand who are already on the committee, and so we can move straight into the development phase. The development phase is where the work is actually done. The technical content is discussed. What needs to change? What needs to stay? Should we phrase it like this or should we phrase it like that? And the development then leads through to drafting. The first draft, second draft, third draft as needed, and then we go out to public consultation. Now, we consult widely on our standards and our standards products, not just with the people who are represented on the committee and their organisations, but we go to a wide range of stakeholders, and we open it up to Joe Public. We open it up so that anybody that has an interest and has something that may be useful can contribute to that process. We then review the submissions if we have any. We look to see whether any of them are sensible. Sorry, I should rephrase that. We look to see what of the sensible suggestions need to change the content that has been put out, or whether there's actually, it's an opinion that I think it should be this, but the committee thinks it should be that, and so we don't think there is a technical reason to change. We will also use this opportunity to pick up things that we might have missed. We've spelled a word wrong, or we've got some of our grammar incorrect. So we'll do some editorial changes as a result of that. We then come to what's called the ballot draft, and we're skipping forward a wee bit. There's a little bit of work in between these two stages, but the ballot draft is really what the committee is then voting on. Are they happy that technically this standard is as good as we can get it? It may not be perfect, but it's as good as we can get it, and we are aiming to get consensus that we have a standard that is fit for purpose and can then be published. Once the ballot has been completed, we go through our final approval stage, which for us in New Zealand requires submission to the Standards Approval Board, which I'm not going to go into at this particular point, but it's a body that is separate from Standards New Zealand that checks that we've actually followed the correct process and that we're not pushing something through that hasn't gone through these preceding stages. Once we have approval, we start to move into our layout and our publication phases, where we make it look more professional. We make sure that any links within the document work, and that it's a document that is actually fit for use. And then after publication, the standard moves into use, and then it's back to often the people who've been involved in contributing to the development to then start putting it into practice. And that, quite briefly, how we develop a standard. That's the life cycle of our standards development process.
Excellent, excellent. I will jump ahead now, taking back over. Just going to talk a little bit about consensus, and in a couple of instances. So consensus is all about bringing everyone along. Standards have to be collaborative, and everybody must be willing to compromise, or at least to agree a position that they can bear. There's someone from Standards Australia once said to me that standards, or that consensus, is making sure everyone is equally unhappy. And this is a joke, obviously, but there is a grain of truth. So yes, the work of a committee is to strive for consensus. It's not to write a standard as you want it. It's to try and make a standard that works for the room, works for the committee, and ultimately, following public consultation, works for everybody. So some of the quotes from the handbook there. About working collaboratively to adopt a workable and lasting solution. So it's not going to be workable if there's one section of people who use the standard disagree with it, and it's not going to be a lasting solution if it's not workable for everybody. And there's a nice little definition of consensus there as well, of taking account of the views of all parties concerned, and trying to reconcile conflicting arguments. Yeah, you'll not always agree, but it's important to speak and to make yourself heard. And if your preferred way of phrasing things, say, or just your, something that you think the standard should cover, if other people are not on board with that, it's not going to fly. You've got to bring people along. So it's one of the hardest things to do often is to move on and to let go, but often it is required. Obviously, you've got to listen to everybody as well and consider their point of view. A good chair will do a lot in bringing out, making sure that people have said their piece, and especially if it affects their interest that they're representing on a committee, or if they have a particular expertise in that field. But still, the onus is on each member to ensure that whether it's via a comment on the Word document or speaking up in meetings, that you raise any objections, or even better, you raise a solution or another good idea. Because the need to speak up relates deeply to the consensus. We expect people to do it during the drafting phase or during the submissions analysis, as opposed to at the end with a vote. So if you have a technical reason that you don't favour the standard, it's important as part of the process that you participate in good faith and raise your objection, so that it can be discussed and it can be worked out and you can find a mutually acceptable solution. Now the Act defines consensus, the Act that we are bound to for all standards work in New Zealand, that calls itself a New Zealand standard, as they define it as unanimity or general agreement characterised by the absence of sustained opposition on any substantial issue, which is quite a high bar, I think you would agree. However, that's still a little woolly when it comes to the vote. When it comes to the vote at the end of the ballot phase, we need something a little more concrete to show what consensus means, or a way to judge it. So in Australia and New Zealand, we have the following criteria. There's 3 elements to it. And you may look at the first 2 of those and think, well, if it has to be 80%, why is there a 67% threshold? Doesn't it already cover that? So there's a little worked example in the handbook, which I'll go through very briefly here. We've got a scenario A is that first row, and a scenario B, which is the second row. And in both instances, we've got a committee of 12, and let's see what happens. Both of these scenarios fail, but they fail for different reasons. If we look at this first one, we've got 8 yes votes. That's great. There were only 10 who voted, so 8 out of 10 is 80%, so it passes that the second criterion. 80 minimum of 80% of the votes received are affirmative. Great. And there's 8 out of 12 of the total eligible voters on the committee that voted yes. So 8 out of 12 is 2/3. And you might look at that first criterion and say, well, 67% is 2/3, isn't it? Or at least, 66.666 repeater. Don't we just round that up to 67? And the way we view this is not quite. What we see this as meaning is that you have to have more than 2/3. That's still 1/3%, right? So in this instance, 2/3 only of the complete committee voted for it. So that fails that first criterion. So what's interesting, I think, of that first one in particular is that if the 2 people who did vote and voted yes, we'd be straight through on both. In scenario B, this time we get 9 yeses and 9 out of the 12 eligible voters, well, that's 75%. So that's great. We've sailed over that 67% mark this time. Of the ones that voted, 9 of them were yes. Fabulous. However, 9 of votes received, 9 out of 12 is also 75%, so we don't pass the 80% criterion in this instance. So as shown by that first one in particular, getting those extra votes that didn't come would have changed things. And one of the reasons we have, especially that first criterion, is to encourage committee engagement and ensure a high threshold of agreement. And this is one of the reasons why we don't allow formal abstentions, because a no reply is the same as a no vote in that first mathematical metric. Now, as for that third bullet there, the no major sector or interest has collectively maintained a negative vote, I'd recommend that you read in the committee handbook how we define that, and it's quite specific as to how that can be triggered. I think the easy takeaway, though, is that it is not easy to trigger this, and it will never be the case that one committee member can hold a veto. That's one of the key precepts of standards development, is that you have to work together, consensus. Okay, now this is the third to last topic, I think. I may be wrong, but we'll say that it is. What makes a good standard? And you'll see in the little subheading there, clarity, simplicity, consistency, knowing its lane. And in a nutshell, that's what makes a good standard. Clarity means spelling out the requirements to conform to the standard clearly, using plain English where possible, using short sentences where possible. I think of engineering standards, where often the considerations and of the requirements can be technically complex, but in those instances, it's even more important to strive for clarity. It may be that 80% of your readership will understand something stated in quite technical language and in a very long sentence, but the idea with clarity is that you're broadening out from that 80% as close to 100 as you can. So you're trying to express things. You're not trying to lose any meaning or lose any of the import of what you're saying there, but you're also considering the more outlier readership, and that's often, say, people entering the field who are new to a particular subject, or they have the qualifications, but some of it is still a bit fresh. There's also people affected by a standard who maybe don't have the technical expertise in that standard, but they want to be able to read it and get the gist of it. And so we should be working for that readership too, without harming the intent of the requirements. Simplicity. So I think when we're thinking about standards as minimum good practice guidance, we should be thinking about what is it that every practitioner in this field should do. And that doesn't mean some of them will do much more and they'll do an amazing extra service. But what is the requirement to do what is acceptable, what is good enough, what we're setting the bar for in this standard? And so where you are describing those requirements, specific requirements for conformance or highly recommended actions, that's all you should have. You don't want to add clutter, explanation and background. Anything unnecessary should be trimmed. Of course, there is often commentary in standards, but the commentary should exist to ensure practitioners can conform to the guidance. there will often be other informative material in standards, tables, sets of diagrams perhaps that you can use for something. So and all of that material, again, it should be there to make it possible for people to conform to the standard. Talking about consistency, I think that's a lot in the terms you use. So it's in using the defined terms and not using synonyms, sticking to the ways you express things. It's in the structure as well. So consistency of structure, and that's perhaps having a predictable or repetitive structure, so people know where the information they're trying to find will occur. It's also consistency across standards, so that things are expressed in the same way, so that if you say you shall do something, that flags a requirement to conform to the standard, and if you say you should do something, that flags a highly recommended action. And section 1 of every standard should have the same material in it, the definitions, the scope, etc. So that's consistency across standards. And all of this, the clarity, the simplicity, and the consistency helps the standard to stick to its lane, to know its lane. The standard is many things. It's not a textbook on a subject. It doesn't have to say everything. It has its scope, and it should have a simplicity of scope. It should have clarity of scope, and the standard should consistently be only responding to that scope. I'm sure you have other thoughts on what can make a good standard, but I think it's always good to revisit that. I will now hand back to Ramola to discuss international adoptions.
Thanks, Nick. Okay. So why does New Zealand adopt international standards? Firstly, it allows us to align our global best practice, and international standards are developed by large expert committees that reflect what's working internationally, and adopting them gives New Zealand access to that expertise without having to recreate it ourselves. Secondly, adoption supports trade, and New Zealand is a small export-focused economy, and using internationally recognized standards reduces those technical barriers and makes it easier for our products and services to operate in global markets. Thirdly, it's proportionate and an efficient approach, and developing every standard domestically would be costly and slow. And adoption lets us focus our limited resources on areas where New Zealand-specific input really matters. And most importantly, adoption is not automatic. We assess each international standard to make sure it's suitable for New Zealand, consult publicly, and make modifications where genuinely needed for local conditions. And adoption also improves accessibility. Once an international standard is adopted as a New Zealand standard, it's available at a domestic price, making it easier for our industry, regulators, and practitioners to use. And therefore, finally, by participating internationally and then adopting standards, New Zealand isn't just complying, but we are actually influencing standards upstream and ensuring they work for us at home. So in short, to summarize this, I feel adoption helps New Zealand stay globally aligned, locally appropriate, and economically efficient. And it's a local solution, and it's not necessarily preventing wheel reinvention and inconsistency with practice elsewhere. So when should international standards be modified for local use? The starting point is that international standards should be adopted identically wherever possible. Alignment is the default, not modification. Modifications are considered only when there's a clear and evidence-based reason why the international standard doesn't work as intended in the New Zealand context. So that might include genuine local conditions such as geography, climate, infrastructure, or system settings that are materially different from those assumed internationally. And modifications may also be appropriate where there may be specific legislative or regulatory requirements that can't reasonably be met through application or guidance alone. And most importantly, modifications are not made simply because of preference, convenience, or to replicate existing local practice. There needs to be a defensible reason that can be explained publicly. So any proposed modification is assessed through a New Zealand committee process, tested through public consultation, and reviewed by the Independent Standards Approval Board. And the aim here is to always strike the right balance, maintaining international alignment while ensuring the standard is fit for purpose in New Zealand. So in short, we modify international standards only where it's genuinely necessary, justified, and transparent.
Fantastic. Thank you, Ramola. I see we've munched through most of our time, so I'll just very quickly take the last topic, and then we'll move on to the questions. So, if you've had any questions percolating in your mind now on any of this stuff, or on anything else, just fire them into that Q&A little box, and Ramola will triage them now. But I'll just talk. I'll just flick these slides through. Really, I think it's all stuff you would be aware of what we expect, and what is good practice for committee members. So, you work together, you prepare, and you clear in your dealings, and are aware that the scope of the project is all important. There was I was trying to get back to the previous slide. Ensuring evidence-based criteria is a good one. I think you can. It's good to just ask people to say, "Oh, do you have evidence for that?" And people will generally say, "Yes, I can show you why we say that." Or when you're making a point, you can refer to other evidence. I think that can be helpful. And yes, yeah, this is usual suspect stuff. And please vote. Please do vote on joint committees, especially where maybe we have less visibility of that voting, if it's the committees being run by Standards Australia. Chairs are so important to to standards development and those who take on that role. Thank you so much. Thank you to everybody who takes on any role in standards, as often it is absolutely voluntary, or you have to do all of your other work somehow as well. So we need chairs to ensure that the process runs well. You'll be working with a project manager. And some of this is true of conveners as well, although often with conveners of mirror committees, there are so many of you that we have to leave you a little more to your own devices. But yes, we want to always discuss, always treat people fairly. Well, we can move to the Q&A section now. And we got any queries, any questions, Ramola?
Yes, so we have one question. What are the pros and cons of adoption versus reference to a full international standard?
I've posted a response to that. Apologies, I was typing as you were talking there. But so my take on this is that one of the reasons we prefer to adopt standard if possible is that we're able to set a price that reduces cost as a barrier to accessibility. We are also able to ensure that the standard is fit for purpose in New Zealand. We don't always have members on the international committee, as Ramola said. There's lots of committees, and we have a portion of them with New Zealand representation. And so adopting them, we will have New Zealand experts, or possibly New Zealand and Australian experts if it's a joint adoption, looking at the standard and saying, yes, it's fit for adoption identically, or it's almost there. We need to have some minor modifications to make it more fit for purpose for New Zealand or for New Zealand and Australia than just referencing the international standard. But wherever possible, we work off of the international standards, and we try to harmonise and line up what we are doing with what the international standards are saying. And for those of you that have had a look through our catalogue over the years, you'll see that there's an awful lot of ISO and IEC adoptions that are in there, because why reinvent the wheel? Nick, Ramola, do you have anything to add?
Sorry if I might dash in on top of that. Just talking about the cons as opposed to the pros as part of the question, which I think it depends on what your purpose is here. So you're talking about reference to an international standard, and that is it's good and well. International standards we approve, but the point, especially when it is referred to perhaps by a regulator, is that we have some control over when the New Zealand standard is adopted, whereas the cyclical process of updates internationally is less outside of our control. So in the perfect world, we are adopting standards very quickly. We're staying up with new editions. We're having New Zealanders look at them, and so referring to a New Zealand edition is going to be better. But there are also times when that is not occurring, and that the local adoption, whether joint or New Zealand, is less in track with the most up-to-date version. We're working with Standards Australia to improve that massively, and are hoping to really have an excellent program of up-to-date adoptions for international standards, which should remove a lot of that particular problem. Did you have anything to add, Ramola, or should we move to the next?
And just to add to that as well, for regulators, adoption provides the assurance that the standard has been reviewed for New Zealand conditions, it's consulted on, and is more accessible to the users. So direct reference is quicker and fully aligned internationally, but sometimes it may lack local validation and can raise access and transparency issues. So, that could be one of the things that we could look into this. Yes, we have received another question. Can you tell us what is happening with global GACI, Globac, GACI, who are registered in Auckland at the IAN's address, because since they were supposed to have stood up on 1st January to allow IAF, ILAC to wind down, we have heard nothing from them. Yeah.
No, is the short answer. IANs are still operating. I know that Globac and GACI are merging the IF ILAC as part of that international accreditation service. We are a separate entity from both IANs and JASANs, even though we work quite closely with them in some cases, and we have representatives from IANs and JASANs on a number of committees. The accreditation services are separate from us. We develop the standard. We are not responsible for accrediting people against the standards and how the standards are assessed. We don't audit or assess. So unfortunately, I don't mean to sound flippant, but no is the short answer. I don't think we have any information that we can share with you on that. Sorry.
I see some members from those bodies on the call now, so unfortunately their mics are muted, but we can move to the next question, I think. So, but I hope you find the answer to that somewhere.
Yeah, no more questions actually. Okay. So, maybe great. I'm getting one now. I'm refreshing.
I'm getting 3 dots appearing.
Anne is from IANS. Anne is in the call, and she could talk to this if we can unmute her.
Yeah, unfortunately, Anne, we the way this particular function of Teams works is it's not a town hall where people can be pulled in. It's sort of us to many. So we can, but if you could put something in writing in, we're happy to pass it along to the person who asked the question. So I could say, Ramola or Roy, did you have any questions of
We do have one more question, just while we are discussing, sorry, yeah. So on the adoption, when we adopt, do we need to have an approval by the other country standard body, like copyrights, etc.?
Right. So when we say adopt, we Standards New Zealand mean that we publish a international standard as a New Zealand standard, and it has a little, often a prefix like NZS space ISO, and then the same number as ISO. So when we say adopt, we mean that that has become a New Zealand standard. Now, like all standards, they are voluntary guidance, unless directed by a particular authority. Maybe your workplace, says that you are to follow this particular standard, or perhaps the government has made a standard an acceptable solution to a particular legal requirement. Or there may be other reasons you're wanting to be have a testing method assessed from a standard. In terms of copyright, to jump to your question, the material in any standard is copyright to the publisher. So if you're wanting to use excerpts from a standard in any sort of other document or in any work, you can come to us and we can provide you with a license to do that. And that applies to ISO, it applies to Australian standards as well. It's a large part of our business is actually licensing content and just ensuring that people are using things correctly, and part of the Act directs that we manage the intellectual property associated with standards, and value it.
We adopt standards, though, Nick. I'm checking my understanding here myself, actually. We adopt standards from ISO and IEC and other bodies under an agreement that we have with them. So yes, Stefano, we do have an approval with the other sort of standards body, but it's a standing agreement that we will do this under this agreement, and that's ISO and IEC have that in place with most countries that adopt their standards.
Yeah, and just to add to that as well, our role as a committee is to assess whether this adoption is appropriate and whether it should be identical or modified within those agreed rules, that Standards New Zealand has with ISO and IC. So, yeah. We have the next question. Is there intended to be a relationship between joint committees and international mirror committees where they work in the same space? This is a hot topic. So.
Tim Gray, lovely question. Thank you. Yes, we would love there to be a relationship between them. Ideally, the New Zealand representatives on the Mirror Committee will be also on the joint committee, so that we have a flow through effect, and that will make it a lot easier for the New Zealand views being put into the international standards to then flow through to a joint adoption. This is a model that Standards Australia use largely. Their mirror committees often form the Australian part of the joint committee. We have some separation between the two historically, and that's often for good reasons. People say, look, I'm really happy to take part in the international work. I can't take part in the joint work just from a capacity perspective, but we would love to have a closer relationship and to actually have more overlap between the mirror committee and the joint committees, so that we have that flow through. So if anyone is out there on an international mirror committee and they want to get involved in the next step of the process in pushing these through the joint pipeline, please let us know, and we will be really happy to take you through that.
Yeah, and just to talk about the distinction between joint committee formation and how international mirror committees are formed, or how you can apply. When you're applying to be on the international mirror committee, we don't ask for endorsement by the representative of the industry, right? You can reach out to us in your individual capacity and say that you're interested to be involved in an international mirror committee, existing or a new one. So that's the difference.
Just on that point, though, we do still vet the person who's put themselves forward. For example, if I said, look, I want to be on the International Mirror Committee on Quantum Computing, our approvals board would say not a hope in hell, because you can hardly work your laptop. So we do still look at the criteria for people to be technical experts, and we do occasionally get people where we say, I'm sorry, we don't think that you fit, but usually people are putting themselves up for their passion areas and their areas of interest, so it's quite smooth.
Yeah, I think this also just leads on to what we just discussed, but I just wanted to highlight this question as well. Given that New Zealand is less represented in the joint committees, how can it be ensured that more people can be on committees on aspects that are more relevant to New Zealand, or where New Zealand industry practice may be ahead of Australia?
So really, it's down to New Zealand, New Zealanders, New Zealand industry, New Zealand government stepping forward to take part in these committees and to take that lead. From a pure numbers game, Australia is a larger country and therefore is likely to always have more people going onto these committees. But we do have some examples of joint committees where there's parity, pretty much 50-50 Australia and New Zealand. So despite that pure population basis, we have per capita more Kiwis on the committee than the Australians do. We do talk with Standards Australia, and where we have new and emerging standards work, part of the agreement that we have with Standards Australia is we'll look at which country actually has the sort of the greatest interest, which has the greatest level of expertise, and which country should therefore be taking the lead in that standard based on the sort of the input and the benefit and those sort of factors. But realistically, if there are areas that are high priority for your industry or your sector or for your government agency, we encourage you to push someone forward, yourself, Rahel, or someone else, if you can volunteer someone in your team that they are going to be on a standards committee. Again, we'll take people through that process. We're keen, always trying to grow New Zealand membership on joint committees. We think that sometimes we have more expertise than is actually represented on those committees, and some of that may be a reflection of the number of small to medium enterprises that we have in New Zealand, where time is money, and people can't free up a few hours here and there because it is quite literally eating into their business. But we're keen to really support people wherever we can to increase the New Zealand representation.
Yes, nicely covered. And we've come to the end of the questions, have we, Ramola? Nodding. Well, I just wanted to say a large thank you to everybody, not just for attending this webinar. You know, we've got looks like screeds of people that have come, so thank you very much for that. But also just all the work you do in the standardization space in New Zealand. We rely on volunteers so much, and it is absolutely appreciated the work you do. So thank you so much. You have our contact details for most of us. If you have further questions, please come to us. Ramola, yes, hello.
Yeah, I just wanted to put a plug in that you will be receiving a feedback form from us, a feedback form link. So please fill out that and, let us know how best we can support your standards work, your standards contribution. We would be very happy to support that. And we will also be sending a recording of one of the webinars that we conducted in the committee handbook space. So, look out for that email from us, and we really appreciate it.
Okay, thank you, everybody. We'll wrap it up there. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon and your possibly late lunch. Thank you.
Okay, thanks.